Hey, work from homers, Adam Schrader here. We love bringing you this podcast, and thousands of you have proven that it's been helpful for you. But since time and online storage space aren't free, Naresh and I wanted to come to you personally to ask for your financial support through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/workfromhomeshow and help support the show. And we appreciate your support at any amount you choose. That's patreon.com/workfromhomeshow. Thanks for your support. Let's get to the show.
Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh, this with Adam Schrader. Today we have Dr. Robin Dunbar with us. He's a professor of evolutionary psychology in the Department of Experimental Psychology at the University of Oxford, and he is best known for formulating Dunbar's number, a measurement of the cognitive limit to the number of individuals with whom any one person can maintain stable relationships. If you remember earlier in the year, or was our first episode of the year to kick off the new year, we talked about our keys to happiness. And there were 4 keys, Adam. You remember those 4 keys? It was making $95,000 per if you're a married couple, then that would be twice as much even with kids. So it's making $95,000. It's the quantity of your friendships, the quality of your friendships, and exercise. And Dr. Dunbar today is going to talk about this Dunbar's number, which has to do with the quantity of friendships. He's a best-selling author of Evolutionary Psychology, a beginner's guide. Dr. Robin Dunbar, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Well, thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, so let's first start with the Dunbar's number, because I think many of our listeners, when you're working from home, one of the challenges that you face is your social life and friendships and maintaining friendships and face-to-face contact, or just contact in general with your colleagues, your bosses, your managers. So let's start from a business perspective. Just tell us a little bit about your research as it applies to telecommuting, teleworking, and your thoughts in that space.
Okay, my goodness. This is life, the universe, and everything. How long have you got? I guess the central issue really is the one that very often gets kind of overlooked by the accountants in business and administration systems. And that's the fact that all these organizations, it doesn't matter whether it's the school board, the local school, a university, a hospital, a government department, a business, anything like that, it's a social world. It consists of people, and they all interact with each other and they relate to each other. And very often the efficiency and productivity of any kind of organization quite literally depends on how well its members get on. So, if they don't get on with each other, they're not going to cooperate, and they're not going to help each other out, and the business is going down the tube as fast as you can care to think of it. So that maintaining those relationships within that business world is really important. And actually, there's another aspect to this. In fact, I don't know whether this applies in this US, but certainly in Europe, there's this kind of pandemic of loneliness among the 20-somethings going to their first job in some big city where they're a complete stranger. They've never been there before. They grew up somewhere. They went to school somewhere else, and then they got this big job in the middle of some third big city. And they arrive there, they know nobody. They don't even know where to go and meet people to make friends, other than the people they work with. So their work environment becomes their primary source of friends until, eventually, obviously, they kind of find friends in the community separate from work. But for a long period, main source of friendships is the people who stare at them across the desk literally every morning. And very often, businesses have tried to sort of restructure their space and kind of said to everybody, look, go home, take a laptop, sit on the beach, do your work from there. If you've got to come in, you can hot desk here. And the first people to object have always been the 20-somethings who said, but we come in to see our friends. That's the only reason we come into work. If we can't come into work, where's our social life going to be? So we kind of forget that. Now, that said, within that framework, obviously your work environment is sort of a little corner of your general social environment, which includes your extended family plus your other friends from previous stages of your life. And taken together, all the people that you have relationships, meaningful relationships with, as you mentioned at the outset, that's Dunbar's number. It's about 150 people on average, give or take a bit. It tends to be a little higher in the 20-somethings. It stabilizes around 150 in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And after 65, it declines steadily.
Can you explain what, the 150, what kind of relationships are you having with those? Because, technically, according to Facebook, I have hundreds of friends. Not that I actually am friends with all of them. But
3,500 for me.
Yeah, I haven't looked. I don't know my number, but I obviously don't have a relationship with them, even though we've, clicked accept on a friend request. So what is a relationship in today's environment?
Well, in any environment, it's a relationship based on history, based on obligation, a sense of trust, reciprocity. They'll do favors for you and you'll do favors for them without really thinking about it. And what seems to be define the boundary at 150, beyond the 150 are several more layers which run out to your Facebook friends. Although I hasten to say, you're at the tail end of the distribution on the number of friends on Facebook. Most people only have somewhere between kind of about, the last serious count of 1 million Facebook pages, somewhere between about 150 and 250 friends listed. But out beyond your kind of 150 friends, there's a layer of acquaintances, which pushes out to about 500. And then there's a whole bunch of people that you nominally would recognize. If you saw a picture of them, you'd be able to say who they were. You could put a name to their face, as it were. It takes you out to about 1,500. But pretty much beyond that, it becomes completely anonymous, the world. Now, the difference between people inside the 150 circle and the people outside the 150 circle is how willing you are to give them some help them out when they're down, when their world falls apart. People within the 150 circle will tend to do that out of a sense of obligation to you, or to, in the case of, let's say, family members, to granny, because they know full well that if they don't give you a helping hand, granny is going to come down like a ton of bricks on you for not helping out her other grandchildren. You should be surprised how much power grannies wield in this context. And in other words, that sense of family structure kind of creates obligations that you, whether you like it or not, you kind of fulfill. But even with friends, within that magic circle of 150, you'll step up to the plate and do what's needed, whether it's kind of lending them $100 or something, or helping them move house, or letting them have a bed for a few nights, or whatever it may be. Beyond that 150 is when you start to really think very carefully and go, I'll do it providing you pay me back in some appropriate way, or return the money to me within such and such a time, and all these kind of conditions, as it were. So it's this willingness to help people out. But that said, your social network is highly, highly structured. So not everybody within the 150 carries the same weight. It actually consists of a series of layers. And for your health and well-being, which is an entirely different matter, the innermost circle of about 5 people, whom I always refer to as the shoulders to cry on friends, they're the ones that really count. They have a huge, huge effect on your psychological health and well-being, your physical health and well-being, even your risk of dying. The quantity, not just the quantity, but the quality of those friendships, that inner circle, magic circle, really is very, very critical. It has a bigger effect on your health and physical health and your risk of dying than absolutely anything that your friendly neighborhood doctor worries about on your behalf.
That's something that the medical community does not talk about enough. Our public health experts, and as we saw during the pandemic, and you probably have some data and research about this, but it wasn't just this virus that took 400,000 people plus in the United States as of this recording, but it was also many people who committed suicide or who
right.
This is not a term for or a cause of death, but it could be, and that is loneliness. I don't think any doctors say, oh, he died of loneliness, she died of loneliness, but it can absolutely contribute to medical ailments. Heart disease is still the number one killer in the United States. I think it is worldwide as well. And it could lead to a broken heart. It could lead to heart issues. What are your thoughts on this?
No, it is completely underestimated by the medical profession generally, who obviously, their tradition is in finding physical medicines that, or surgery or whatever, that physical interventions, if you like, that cure your disease.
That makes money.
And of course, that's true. As the saying goes, you may say that, I couldn't possibly comment. But I think the psychological components of it has been surprisingly not noticed, except that in the last decade or so, there's been this absolute tsunami of studies, epidemiological studies, showing that the single best predictor of people's susceptibility to disease, as well as their risk of succumbing to it, is affected by the number of close friends that they have, both the number and the quality. So we've just published a paper which is based on a very large sample from, I think, 11 European countries, looking at the risk of depression as just an example of this. And you minimize your risk of depression by having 5 close friends or being involved in, I think it was 3 voluntary activities. So let's say helping with the Boy Scouts, or if you go to a church or similar, helping out there, or at least attending, where you're going to meet people, or helping with the local junior baseball team, or whatever it may be, or the Ramblers Association. You're engaged in some voluntary activity. And you can trade these against each other. So you can have 3 friends and 2 voluntary activities, and that works just as well. What you can't do is add them together. So you can't have 5 friends and 3 voluntary activities. And the reason is very simple. It's the reason you can only have 5 friends. And that is, it's the time you invest in these friends and or activities. And of course, all these are social activities. You're meeting people, talking to people, having a laugh with people. And to build up a friendship of that kind of strength takes a huge amount of time and focus. It doesn't come for free. And if you try and spread your load and time too thinly among too many people in the hopes that you'll do better still, it won't work, because you'll actually end up being worse off. So having 7 or 8 friends is no better than having 2 friends in terms of susceptibility to depression, or indeed many of these other conditions, including dementia, and indeed heart attacks is the other one that's been highlighted in many studies. So, there's something peculiar about, something magical, if you like, about having close friends. Now, they may be family, I should say. This inner core of 5 best friends, shoulders to cry on friends, typically consists of 2 friends and 2 close family members, and kind of like an odd one to make up the difference. Doesn't have to, of course. It can all be friends, or it can all be family members. People who come from a big family tend to have fewer friends. Big extended families tend to have fewer friends because they spend all their time chasing around, keeping up with their cousins, their 40 first cousins. So, it's about investment of time in the quality of relationships as much as it is in terms of just the sheer number.
Well, you talk about having like the 5 core and then, your 15 or so that are good friends. Can you kind of supplement and say you have like 3 really good friends, but 17 close friends who aren't like necessarily the big shoulders you'd cry on? Or does it have to be, not have to be, but is it really recommended you have the 5? And then my other part of this is, you talk about the number being 150. Does everybody have 150 and they just don't know it? Or does it just vary person by person?
That first question is quite interesting. Can you have fewer, what you might call them, sort of close friends and more best friends? The best friends, that 15 circle, which also includes the inner 5, I may say. So it's not 15 extra. It's 10 extra on top of your 5, or your notional 5. That group of 15 is really your major source of everyday social activity. They're the ones you kind of go out with. If you have somebody around to dinner, it'll probably be one of them. If you fancy an evening out at the cinema or the theater or something, you'll ring up one of them and say, you're interested. If you just want to hang out on the beach for Sunday afternoon or something like that, it'll be one of that group. So there is a sense in which you probably can trade these off a little bit against each other. But that said, I think this inner core of around about typically 5, that's the average, really do seem to be important in a way the next layer are not quite so important. On the other hand, just the weightings suggest that you devote 40% of your total social time, your available social time and effort, to the inner core of 5 people. And then the next 10 people that make up the 15 layer get 20% of your total time. So 60% of your time is devoted to just 15 people, but it's heavily weighted to the inner core because the inner core provides such benefits. Now, the second question you raised really is this nature of the variability, individual differences. And the figures I'm giving, the 5, 15, 150, really are just averages across the population. They're extremely robust. We find them everywhere we look, consistently so. But there's a lot of variability around that. So in terms of the 150, the range of variation kind of in the normal population is realistically from about 100 up to about 250. And in terms of the inner core of 5, it probably varies between about 3 and 7, something like that. Now, there are various sources that affect the variability here right the way through. In part, age is important. So you tend to have a lot of friends in your 20-somethings, and then you become more selective in your 30s and narrow them down. It's as though you're kind of searching the world as widely as you can to find the best guys to hang out with. And then, you do that for 10 or 15 years. Sometime around the mid-30s, you kind of become more selective, anchor down on, focus on about the 150 core ones, and it remains very stable after that. There is a strong personality effect. There's mainly a difference due to introverts versus extroverts. Introverts tend to have smaller social circles. They tend to be between, let's say, 100 and 150, perhaps 3 to 5 on the inner core circle of magical friends. Extroverts tend to be have more friends, typically around 150 to 250 On the inner layers, they tend to go for 5 to 7 special friends. And the difference really is simply in risk aversiveness. So introverts tend to be risk averse here. They want to make sure their friendships are going to work when they need them. Because the problem is, when your life falls apart, that is not the time you go out and look for friends. It's too late. Nobody's going to help you at that point. You've had to invest in creating friendships if they're going to do the job you require when you need them. So what introverts tend to do is to play a more cautious game, focus their attention on fewer friends and just make sure they really work. Whereas the impression I have really with extroverts is they're not only risk prone, if you like, but also they trade on their social confidence. So they feel they can go out and wing it in a social environment. And so they're prepared to kind of maximize the number of friends they have, because in some senses, that's quite valuable. It gives you access to more sources of information, gives you more choice, of course. When you fall out with somebody, you've got somebody else in tow that you can go straight to rather than having to start all over again. And the other big difference is the gender difference. So girls tend to have more close friends than boys do. They both tend to end up at about 150 for the total social circle. Once you get into Facebook, girls tend to stick with 150 by and large. It's the boys that go wild and try and sign up everybody. I mention no names here, but
I blame our large numbers with being like the first wave of Facebook. I've been on Facebook for 17 years now, so over time you just add up and you never unfriend people.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yes. I mean, I'm sure that's true.
And rugby, just everywhere I've been, you join a new team and suddenly you have 70 new friends.
Exactly. Yeah. But I mean, what normally happens? I mean, it's in a sense, it's Facebook it's not created the problem. It's made this possible in a way that wouldn't have happened in pre-Facebook times. In other words, your life, as it were, has been a nomadic wandering around the mainland USA. There, you 6 months here on a job, you're a couple of years somewhere else. You move on to a different job somewhere else, or you get sent by your company maybe. And so you pick up groups of friends in each of these places. Now, in the past, they would kind of have disappeared fairly quickly. Within a year or two of your moving on. The letters just didn't have the same kind of effect, too slow. And the third big factor that affects the size of your friendship circles is really gender. So although men and women tend to have the same sized 150 circles, women have much bigger inner circles than men do, and not by a huge amount, because of course these circles are small. So the difference might be in the innermost circle of shoulders to crown friends. Guys, it would be typically perhaps 4 to 5. The girls would be maybe 5 to 7, something of that order, with the two together averaging out at the 5 that we see in general. And that has to do with the fact that girls are somewhat more intensely social than boys, so they can maintain more friendships typically than boys do.
Let's go back to talking about technology and social media. And do you think that technology, the world that we live in today, social media, do you think that is helping build stable relationships to the point that we don't have to see people in person? We don't need to talk to them on the phone. Like, do you think that's a good thing? And do you think friendships are improving? I just want to hear the research, because personally, I think I've had a lot of great friendships because of social media. I've a lot of people who I would never talk to on the phone, never meet in person. They know what's going on with me. I know what's going on with them. And if we happen to be in the same city, we might meet up and we'll know everything about each other. And I think that's a pretty cool thing. At the same time, these big tech companies have gotten so politically aligned that I've lost friends on social. Well, I've lost friends like in person because of social media, because I supported one candidate or because I supported some issue. And I don't really post much about politics, but I know some people who do. I mean, all they post is politics, and they're just losing friends left and right. So what are your thoughts?
Yes, it's all very entertaining, I think, is the answer. The politics of the current times. Our research is fairly clear, and I think this is borne out by pretty much everybody's who's worked in this area, that what the social media do is provide a very good sticking plaster which prevents friendships declining in the absence of being able to meet up. So what would normally happen in the course of everyday life, is some of your friends would go off to another city. You wouldn't be able to see them so easily, and very gradually but inexorably, the quality of your relationship with them would decline. So that over a couple of years or so of not seeing them, they would gradually drift down from being kind of within that, certainly within that inner 15 circle. Within 2 or 3 years or so, they'd end up as an acquaintance beyond the 150. So it's somebody I once knew, I knew quite well, used to do a lot with them, but really haven't seen them for a long time, don't really know what they're doing these days, don't have much in common maybe on the odd occasions when we do meet up now. So this creates this constant churn and turnover in friendships in particular. It doesn't really affect family relationships because whether you like them or not, you're stuck with them. Friends, at least you can choose. But friendships are then very susceptible to these investment effects. You have to keep seeing them. But it seems to us that social media do quite a good job in providing a sticking plaster on that decline. But at the same time, it only slows it down. It's not a panacea for this problem. So eventually, it seems that unless you meet up face to face from time to time, doesn't have to be, perhaps more than once a year or something like that. If you can meet up once in a while, that's what will really hold the friendship in place. Otherwise, just a Facebook friend will become just a Facebook friend in the end and no more. Now, the question you have to ask in this context, I think, really is, does it matter or is it a good idea that social media is helping you keep track with friends? At one level, the answer is, of course, it's kind of cool and that's kind of fun because, people whom you otherwise would have lost track of completely, you're able to keep up with. And maybe, as you say, if you happen to be over their way, you could meet up with them and have dinner or a beer or something. But there is a sense in which you can invest too much in these relationships once they've gone. And this applies, I think, particularly to the inner core, the shoulders to cry on relationships, because you really need those nearby. A virtual shoulder to cry on is not a shoulder to cry on. Yeah, you need to be able to hold on to it physically, if you like. And so trying to keep those relationships going might be seriously disadvantageous. You might actually be better off letting them go and using the time freed up to go and knock on a few more doors up and down your street, as they say, and find some new local friends who can fit into that slot. Of course, they have to, satisfy the requirements in terms of comparability. It's not a case of anybody will do. There are, if you like, preferences and standards that you set for your friends. And if you lose one of those, you want somebody who's kind of similar. But this is a big difference, I think, between men and women, especially between in the teenage years, between the girls and the boys. In that the girls will invest a huge amount of time on Facebook and texting and email and the phone, trying to keep up with friendships that have moved away, whereas boys who live in a kind of semi-social world, I've come to think of it as, it's much more casual and here today and gone tomorrow, and kind of out of sight, out of mind. If a friend moves away, well, that's too bad, but we'll substitute Peter with Jimmy, who will fill Peter's shoes perfectly adequately in the meantime while Peter's not there. If ever Peter comes back, you may be able to pick up where you left off. That seems to happen quite well. But these kind of very casual arrangements that boys have, in some senses, advantageous, because it means at least you always keep finding somebody nearby who can provide that kind of social and emotional and financial and whatever support that we all need to keep us on the psychological straight and narrow. And I worry that the girls are investing particularly young girls, are investing far too much time trying to keep friendships going when it's not actually in their interest to do that.
Do you find that there's a time or an age that people reach where, if you lose one of your, inner 5 or even your, 15 friendships that are close, that they just say, I'm not going to replace that person, that you just kind of, your 5 becomes 4, or your 15 becomes 14? Is there kind of a delineation when it's not as important to people, or does it kind of hold true throughout your entire life?
Oh, I think for most of us, for most people, if a friend or a family member, whatever it may be, a member of your social network disappears for some reason, or dies, or just moves too far away to keep contact with in any form, then we naturally replace them. I mean, we're constantly being bombarded with new potential friends all the time, and we select among them and decide whether or not to invest in them. So, I don't think that really happens so much in any of the kind of younger or middle-aged generations. It does start to kick in, though, from about 65 onwards. What seems to happen is from about 65 onwards, your social network starts to contract back towards sort of very, very small numbers if you live long enough. And this seems to happen inexorably. And in part, it's due to the fact that when you lose friends or family members, you just don't have the motivation or the energy to get up and go out and meet new people who can fill those slots. And secondarily, even if you had the energy and the motivation, you kind of don't know by that stage where to go. The kinds of places you went when you were younger to find new friends, if you like, be it the dance club in your teenage years, or I don't know, the tennis club, or whatever it may be during your middle years. If you go along there, you kind of don't fit in quite the same way, and you feel you don't fit in, and that's assuming the bouncer on the door doesn't throw you out before you even get a foot inside the door. Even if you got into, the dance club, let's say, you kind of don't know what you're supposed to do. You don't know what people talk about anymore at that sort of venue, that sort of age group that inhabit these places. So, you're not really in a good place, I think, and the older generation, sort of are the ones that have for a long time exhibited this very striking loneliness pandemic that doesn't do their health or their mental state any good at all.
Talking about men, because I'm a man, Adam's a man. We've had some experts talk about men and how men can be more involved. And I think one of the big problems, and I'm sure your research finds this, or you already said that men tend to have fewer close friendships. And I think a lot of it, just thinking about my own experience, I think once a man gets married and has a child or children, then their social life just kind of goes out down the drain. I don't know if your research found that, but that's what I've noticed with a lot of my friends and with even me. And we had two guests on our show who encouraged. They said, look, even if you have children, you need to have your guys' night out type of hangouts, because it's just very important for quality of friendships, for longevity of friendships, and for mental health. What do you find?
I think this is what everybody finds. The thing that destroys your entire social life of both sexes, clearly, is the arrival of children, and it's a very long tunnel you go into because it takes a very long time to rear children, 20 years or more. While you're at one end you're kind of providing food and shoveling food and changing nappies, as they say, and at the other end you're providing the taxi service usually to and from clubs and other venues of entertainment where teenagers gather. So it's a long, hard road, but undoubtedly probably the most rewarding one of all, of course, because the advantage of children is they produce grandchildren, if you're lucky, eventually. And just observing grandparents and grandchildren is a marvel on how much grandparents are willing to give endlessly of time and effort and kind of teaching and talking and all sorts of things, which often parents don't have the time to do.
It can drive the parents crazy, but that's just my personal opinion.
Well, that's right. And here's the big advantage of being grandparent is you can hand them back at the end of the day.
You can send them back home.
You can send them back home. Exactly. So, but I think this is partly why you see this fallback, this sort of selection process going on that reduces the size of your social circle from somewhere around 250 in the early 20s down to about 150 in the mid 30s, and that's largely the impact of marriage and child rearing. A kind of marriage is kind of interesting because actually guys give up having any kind of social life usually because they just sort of adopt their wives' social networks. It's quite remarkable to watch, which causes problems actually for them at the other end, because if they're divorced particularly, but also if through bad luck, as it were, the wife happens to die young, the guy has no social network anymore. There's a big hole because all his friends were his wife's friends, and they tend to kind of stick with the wife's side of the family inevitably, particularly if it's a case of divorce. And that can lead to a lot of problems for guys, I think, who go through that. But this goes back to another kind of observation that guys' relationships are very, very different to the girls' relationships in two important respects. One is we've found in our data anyway, we didn't actually believe it until it just kept popping out. But girls tend to have two best friends, their romantic partner, and then a best friend forever, who's usually another girl. Something like 85% of the best friends forever are a girl. A few of them are boys, but the majority are girls. And they manage these two relationships. One is obviously the romantic partnership is obviously sexual in part. The best friend forever is a platonic relationship and is very important to them. And boys don't have these in quite the same sort of sense. Yeah, they might say, if you ask them, do you have a best friend? And the guy will think for a minute and say, oh yeah, Jimmy. I go out on a Friday night with Jimmy. But actually, the truth to tell is, if Jimmy wasn't there, Pete would do. It's a much more casual. But also, they seem not to be able to handle two relationships, close relationships of that kind simultaneously. So they either are married and have a romantic partner, or they have a best friend they go drinking with. And never, you almost never get both at the same time. And that's partly goes back to this difference between the social psychology, as much as anything, of men and women. But the other aspect is really very striking, and that's in how friendships are made. So our research shows very, very clearly that the two sexes differ radically in this respect. So what prevents women's friendships declining over time is investing time in talking, right? Now, if you look at boys' friendships and ask what prevents their relationships declining over time, if they can't meet up very easily, talking has zero effect, absolutely zero effect. What makes the difference for boys is doing stuff together. So it might be kind of going out on a beer bust or something. It might be rambling in the hills. It might be, sort of surfing on or whatever. It's an activity-based thing. Canoeing, climbing, up and down the Grand Canyon, or whatever your choice of physical activity is. It tends to be very physical. It tends not to involve huge amount of conversation, and the conversation style of men and women is very different in this respect too. The guys, it tends to involve a lot of just joking and joshing and having fun at each other's expense, which is not kind of terribly serious. Nobody takes it terribly seriously, but it gives a basis for a laugh. But it probably isn't too deeply intellectual, whereas girls' conversations tend to be much, much more focused on emotions and relationships. And I, this is a hurdle that will not easily be overcome. You can't turn boys into girls or girls into boys in this respect that easily.
Excellent. Dr. Robin Dunbar, greatly appreciate your time on the Work From Home show. Best-selling author of Evolutionary Psychology, a beginner's guide. And he is known for formulating Dunbar's number, which, as we learned on this episode, that number is around 150. It's a measurement of the cognitive limit to the number of individuals with whom any one person can maintain stable relationships. Dr. Dunbar, any final thoughts you want to share with our listeners, or anything else you want to plug?
Oh, well, I do have a book coming out, and it's just called Friends, Everything You Wanted to Know.
Listeners, go get the book Friends, not the TV show, but the book Friends. It sounds like we hit a lot of topics that are in that book. So Dr. Robin Dunbar, thanks so much for joining us on the Work From Home show. And to all our listeners, check us out at workfromhomeshow.com. That's www.workfromhomeshow.com. Email us at hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com. Leave us reviews on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, any podcasting platform that you use. We're on Amazon Music, Audible. We're everywhere. We just crossed 15,000 listeners, so we're really thrilled about that. And until next time and next week, keep on working from home.